So we're continuing on in our week 5 focus on desegregation and integration in the civil rights movement. In my first lecture, I focused on the desegregation of public schools, but they were not the only segregated facilities. The Montgomery bus boycott desegregated transportation and also thrust Dr. Martin Luther King into the national spotlight. Okay, so one thing I want to emphasize here is because I think that there's often a myth about Rosa Parks, so I'm going to try and clear that up for our class and talk about some things that I think are really important to understand about the bus boycott. That first of all, it was not exactly a planned action, but it wasn't by accident either. NAACP leaders in Montgomery had been talking about how to challenge segregation on buses. Buses were an extremely popular form of transportation for African Americans, and they were very much treated like second-class citizens on them. So December 5th, 1955 is the start of the boycott, but I'm sure most of you know the story that it starts with Rosa Parks, but there were actually a couple cases before hers. And the one right before hers was Claudette Colvin, who is often most frequently referred to. She was a 15-year-old girl, and shortly after she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat like Rosa Parks, she became pregnant. And some local NAACP leaders chose to not necessarily pursue her case as an inspiration for a boycott because they were concerned that people would not rally around her because of her pregnancy at 15. So I know that can be difficult for some of us to understand, but the civil rights movement in the beginning is very focused on image and looking middle class, because they felt like that was the way to be most successful. So then we come to Rosa Parks. She was a seamstress. So I think the most popular image of her is kind of this old lady who was tired from a long day of work, who sat down and just refused to get up more because of her exhaustion than anything else. First of all, she wasn't old. She was 42, which I'm hoping most of you will sympathize is actually very young. She was a secretary for the local chapter of NAACP and an advisor to the NAACP youth group in her area. Her and her husband had been involved in other civil rights actions. Parks herself had registered to vote for the first time in 1946, and as you know, that was not an easy thing to do. She took a workshop called Racial Desegregation, Implementing the Supreme Court Decision at Tennessee's Highlander Folk School, which I don't know how many of you are aware of that school, but it's actually still in operation, and basically they teach classes on civil rights demonstrations, how to demonstrate for civil rights, how to push for your own, advocate for your own civil rights, and it's a very important school during the civil rights movement for people to go to and learn how these peaceful demonstrations work. So it was not planned. She did not get on that bus planning to make a stand. However, the idea that she's some feeble old lady who is just tired kind of takes hold in popular myth, and the reality is none of those things. She knew what she was doing when she sat down on that bus. She knew what she was saying when she said, "You can arrest me." She was not going to move. So I have what I think is a great quote from Rosa Parks. People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or not more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me being old then. I was 42. No. The only tired I was tired of giving in. sorry, her words are very powerful to me because I think it's important to understand that what she's saying is that she was tired of being treated like a second-class citizen. So, these are her fingerprints, her police report, and a picture so that you can see she was not an old lady. She was, as I said, 42. This is Claudette Colvin, who, as I said, was one of the earlier cases, and she actually will become a part of the case that ends the Montgomery bus boycott, which I'm going to talk about at the end of my presentation. So I think it's important to understand that she was a strong civil rights advocate and not see her as some feeble old lady. It's just not the reality. So another prominent figure that comes about in the Montgomery bus boycott is Martin Luther King. He was a minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. African American churches had a long history of being really involved in the fight for civil rights, not just during the civil rights movement, but really since starting with the Civil War and even a little bit before that. African Americans were sometimes encouraged to be Christian, and they found that their churches were a place that they could be with their own people in a gathering that was not as threatening, and they could talk about their rights. So churches, African American churches, are very important to the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King had not been with the church very long. He was new to the area, but he was aware of the issues. He made a purposeful choice to move to the South to hopefully help incur some social justice. He knew it was a dangerous, hard place for people, African American people, to live. So out of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church forms after Rosa Parks' arrest, almost immediately after her arrest, they formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, and Martin Luther King is elected the president of that group, which is organizing the boycott. Like I said, he was already an advocate for social justice. He didn't doubt the cause, but he often doubted himself, which I think is, like I said in my lecture before when I talked about grassroots organizing, I think it's important for us to understand that we see history often as a given. King didn't know what he was doing when he got involved in this bus boycott. He didn't know how successful it would be. He didn't know what would happen to him. He didn't know if he could have the strength and the faith to lead these people, and he was very concerned and often had a lot of doubts about himself and his leadership in the movement. He got a lot of support from other civil rights activists, so that was really important. So, for example, Bayard Rustin, who I don't mention on the slide, but he was important to the movement since World War II and that area. It had come down from New York and kind of given him some pointers on nonviolent movement, because King becomes kind of this bastion of the nonviolent movement, and people see him as this hero, but in the beginning, he wasn't sure that the nonviolent principles were going to work. He was very uncertain. And in fact, early on, for the Montgomery bus boycott started, he registered to have a gun. But in the end, with the help of some others, I think he sees, especially with his faith in God, that this is how to go about winning the civil rights for African Americans. And once he sets the path, he really continues to maintain it. Even after his home is bombed, there's a lot of angry protests, but he maintains that nonviolence is the way to go, that he doesn't want to see people act violently on his behalf. He really rises to national prominence. He's on the cover of Time. The bus boycott really projects him into the national spotlight. He becomes hugely important and popular. I mean, there's no doubt. One of the great things about the internet world we live in is that you can go listen to his speeches now. You just Google Martin Luther King, and there are voice recordings of him. He was a beautiful orator. He spoke well. He was charismatic, um, but he was also very humble. He himself said, I neither started the protest nor suggested it." But he really does become the leader and the symbol not only of the Montgomery bus boycott, but eventually of the civil rights movement. Um, like I said, it's important to understand how big a movement this was. People had to walk to work, and most people did not live near where they worked. This is a picture of African American women walking to work. Um, and they did other things, like they arranged carpools and they helped each other out, and it was really a community action. It's an amazing grassroots movement again. It's a community taking care of themselves, taking care of each other, and helping each other to meet this goal. Um, so, like I said, it's important to understand that these people, this was a far distance to travel, and they did not own cars. So the bus had been their only means of transportation. And really, a lot of them walked very far after having worked all day. Um, so there was a lot of opposition. Obviously, this was a threat to an economic way of life. The bus, some Montgomery citizens put additional pressure on white businesses by stopping shopping at them. And people were losing business and money. And if there's ever a doubt that economic pressure it brings change, I think the Montgomery bus boycott is an excellent example. There's a lot of opposition. There are violent attacks, intimidation from white employers. Often people were fired or they threatened to fire them. In 1965, they arrested 90 of the MIA leaders for conspiring to boycott. And you may not understand that the boycott, as they're talking about, is a little different than what they were actually doing. A boycott to destroy a business, that's not what they were doing, and that's what Martin Luther King makes really clear in some of his writing and his letters and the way he spoke in court. They're trying to enact social justice, and they're allowed to do that. They also tried to shut down carpools. They put out propaganda that from themselves that against the boycott. So I mean, there's an immense amount of pressure for African Americans to ride the bus, and yet they did not. So the outcome of the Montgomery bus boycott. Browder versus Gale in 1956 ruled basically, as I said earlier, multiple women came together in this suit. Parks is not one of them, even though it's her case that kind of sparks the flame to get the protest going. But it's other women like Claudette Colvin who come together, and the Supreme Court rules, excuse me, that segregation on the buses. Basically, that case then finally reaffirms with the Supreme Court that the segregation on the bus is not legal. And I do want to note that the bus company actually wanted to kind of give into pressure sooner, but it was the local leaders of the government who basically said no, that the buses were segregated by law, and that was going to continue. It also, as I've said, thrust Martin Luther King Jr. into the national spotlight, and he would soon then go on to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which becomes an important group in the civil rights movement. And it will also lead to freedom rides, which I'm going to talk about more next week, which is a continued grassroots movement to desegregate the buses across state lines. So, in conclusion, I just want to say again that, my focus this week is on integration and desegregation. Um, this is an important desegregation of public transportation. It, once again, we see that it's grassroots movements that really put pressure on the federal government to do what needs to be done for desegregation. And it also brings King to the national spotlight, and he becomes an important nonviolent leader in the movement. So my reference slide this week, there's some great reference material on Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin and also Martin Luther King. So be sure you guys check additional materials out if you're interested. Thanks again. Have a great week.